It is just before dawn in the eastern Mediterranean, and you are standing in the ruins of a palace that no one has entered for 300 years. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint scent of wild thyme and salt from the distant sea. Around you, massive stone walls rise from the earth, their surfaces blackened by ancient fire. The roof has long since collapsed, and the chambers that once echoed with the voices of scribes and kings now lie open to the sky. In the pale light you can see scattered fragments of painted plaster, the remains of frescoes that once depicted processions of gift-bearers and scenes of royal ceremony. The colors have faded to ghosts of themselves, red ochre turned to rust, blue to gray. Beneath your feet, the flagstones are cracked and uneven, pushed upward by centuries of frost and root growth. Somewhere in the rubble, buried under fallen masonry and wind-blown soil, are the remnants of an archive, hundreds of clay tablets inscribed with a script that no living person can read. This is the world after the collapse, a world that has forgotten how to write. The story you are about to hear is not the story of a single catastrophic event, a dramatic fall that happened in a single season or year. It is the story of a slow, inexorable unraveling that took place over generations, as the intricate web of Bronze Age civilization came apart thread by thread. It is the story of the Dark Age that followed, when writing disappeared from Greece for 400 years, when great cities were abandoned, when the complex machinery of palace economies ground to a halt and the world became smaller, quieter, and profoundly changed. But it is also a story of resilience and transformation, of how communities adapted to the loss of everything they had known, of how memory was preserved in the absence of writing, and of how, slowly and haltingly, the light began to return. This is a journey through one of history's most mysterious periods, a time when civilization itself seemed to pause and take a long, uncertain breath before beginning again. So settle in now. Let the noise and urgency of the modern world fade into the background. Allow yourself to drift backward through the centuries, past the rise of Rome, past the golden age of classical Greece, past even the shadowy beginnings of the Olympic Games, back to a time when the world was darker and stranger than we can easily imagine. Tonight we will walk together through the long twilight that followed the end of the Bronze Age. We will explore what it meant to live in a world that had lost its palaces, its writing, its certainties. We will listen to the stories that were told around fires in the darkness, and we will watch as slowly, painfully, the dawn began to break once more. Now let us begin our journey into the past, into the silence and the slow rebirth that followed the greatest collapse the ancient Mediterranean world had ever known. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what the world was like before it fell. Imagine the Eastern Mediterranean in the 13th century, before the Common Era, at the height of what archaeologists call the Late Bronze Age. This was a world of astonishing complexity and interconnection, a world bound together by trade routes that stretched from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from the Aegean to the shores of the Black Sea. At the heart of this world were the great palace civilizations, the Mycenaean kingdoms of mainland Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the coastal cities of the Levant, and the ancient kingdoms of Egypt and Mesopotamia. These were not isolated powers but parts of a single, interlocking system, dependent on one another for the metals, grain, and luxury goods that sustained their Bronze Age economies. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces stood as centers of wealth and administrative control. The greatest of these was Mycenae itself, its massive walls built of stones so large that later Greeks believed they had been raised by giants. Within those walls stood a palace complex of interconnected rooms, storerooms filled with oil and grain, workshops where craftsmen produced delicate gold jewelry and bronze weapons. At the heart of the palace was the Megaron, a great hall with a central hearth where the king, the Wonax, held court. But the true power of these palaces lay not in their fortifications but in their bureaucracies. In small, cramped archive rooms, scribes sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully inscribing clay tablets with a script we now call Linear B. These tablets recorded everything: inventories of bronze vessels and wheeled chariots, rations distributed to workers, offerings made to the gods. The Mycenaean world was a world of lists and accounts, of careful record-keeping and centralized control. Trade flowed through this world like blood through a living body. Ships sailed from the ports of Greece carrying fine pottery, olive oil and wine, and returned laden with copper from Cyprus, tin from the distant reaches of Anatolia, or even Afghanistan, ivory from Syria, and luxury goods from Egypt. The copper and tin were essential, for when smelted together they produced bronze, the metal that gave this age its name. Bronze was harder and more durable than pure copper, and it could be cast into elaborate shapes: swords and spearheads, armor and helmets, cauldrons and tripods. The production of bronze required a complex international network, for copper and tin were rarely found in the same place. A Mycenaean smith working in his forge was dependent on trade routes that stretched across thousands of miles of land and sea. If those routes were disrupted, if the supply of tin dried up, his furnaces would grow cold. The air in a Bronze Age palace smelled of oil and smoke, of damp clay and the sharp tang of metal. In the storerooms, great pithoi, ceramic jars taller than a man, stood in rows filled with olive oil or wine. The oil was stored for trade, for offerings to the gods, for distribution as rations to the palace workers. The floors of the storerooms were often plastered and painted, and the walls were decorated with frescoes showing scenes of nature and ceremony. Dolphins leaping in a blue sea, women in elaborate gowns carrying vessels, processions of tribute bearers approaching the throne. Light entered these rooms through narrow windows set high in the walls, falling in dusty shafts across the painted floors. In the workshops, the sound of hammering rang out as bronzesmiths shaped weapons and tools, as potters threw clay on their wheels, as weavers worked at their looms producing textiles dyed with precious purple and crimson. This was a world of specialists, each person performing a role within the larger machinery of the palace economy. Beyond the walls of the palaces, the landscape was dotted with smaller settlements, farmsteads and villages where the majority of the population lived. These people grew wheat and barley, tended flocks of sheep and goats, harvested olives and grapes. They owed a portion of their produce to the palace, delivered as taxes or tribute, and in return they received protection and access to the goods that flowed through the palace's trade networks. The relationship was one of mutual dependence, but it was also fragile. If the palace could no longer provide security, if the trade networks failed, if the carefully balanced system of redistribution broke down, the entire structure would begin to totter. And that is precisely what began to happen in the decades around 1200 BCE. The collapse did not arrive all at once. It came like a slow wave, gathering force over years and decades, eroding the foundations of the Bronze Age world until the entire edifice came crashing down. The causes were multiple and overlapping, a perfect storm of environmental stress, political upheaval, and military invasion. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the climate began to change. Tree ring data and archaeological evidence suggest that the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE were marked by severe drought. Harvests failed, grain stores dwindled, and populations began to move in search of food and water. In the archives of the Hittite Empire, we find desperate letters from kings pleading for shipments of grain, speaking of famine and unrest. The carefully calibrated system of trade and redistribution that had sustained the Bronze Age world was breaking down. At the same time, the political landscape was shifting. The great powers of the Bronze Age had maintained a delicate balance, conducting diplomacy through letters written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the age, addressing one another as brothers. But this balance was fragile, and when the system came under stress, old alliances dissolved. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia for centuries, began to fragment. Cities on its southern frontier came under attack from groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, a confederation of displaced populations moving by land and sea. Who exactly the Sea Peoples were remains one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Egyptian texts describe them as coming from the islands and the lands to the north, but their origins are unclear. They may have been refugees fleeing drought and famine, or raiders taking advantage of the chaos, or some combination of both. What is certain is that they left destruction in their wake. One by one, the great centers of Bronze Age civilization fell. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, was burned and abandoned. The coastal cities of Ugarit and Byblos, thriving centers of trade and culture, were destroyed. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces met a similar fate. Pylos on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese burned so fiercely that the clay tablets in its archive were baked hard, preserving them for modern archaeologists to read. Mycenaean itself was attacked and damaged, its great walls no longer sufficient protection. Thebes, Tiryns, or Orchomenos, all suffered destruction. Some were rebuilt on a smaller scale, but many were abandoned forever. The palace at Pylos was never rebuilt. The megaron, where kings had feasted and scribes had recorded the affairs of state, lay open to the sky, its roof timbers charred and fallen. The experience of this collapse, for those who lived through it, would have been one of creeping dread and confusion. Imagine you are a scribe in a Mycenaean palace in the decades before its fall. Your world is one of routine and order. Each day you sit in the archive room, your writing tablet resting on your knees, carefully incising symbols into the damp clay with your stylus. You record deliveries of grain from the surrounding countryside, allocations of bronze to the smiths, offerings of oil to the gods. The tablets are not meant to last. They will be discarded once the information is no longer needed, but the system itself seems eternal, as solid as the cyclopean walls that surround the palace. Then slowly, things begin to change. The shipments of copper and tin grow less frequent. There are rumors of cities destroyed in distant lands, of fleets of ships appearing on the horizon. The palace increases its fortifications, and able-bodied men are mobilized for defense. The usual rhythm of trade and ceremony is disrupted. And then, one night, the palace burns. Perhaps the attack comes without warning. Raiders scaling the walls under cover of darkness. Perhaps there is a battle, the clash of bronze weapons, the screams of the wounded, or perhaps the palace is destroyed by its own subjects. A revolt born of hunger and desperation. We cannot know with certainty. What we know is the aftermath. The roof collapses in flames. The painted frescoes are blackened by smoke. The great storage jars shatter in the heat, their contents spilling and burning. You, the scribe, may flee with whatever you can carry. Or perhaps you perish in the flames, your final tablet still clutched in your hands. In the weeks and months that follow, the survivors scatter. Some seek refuge in more remote areas, in the hills and mountains where the destruction has not reached. Others take to the sea, joining the displaced populations moving along the coast. The palace is gone, and with it, the entire apparatus of administration and record-keeping. The world you knew has ended. In the aftermath of the collapse, the world entered what scholars call the Greek Dark Age, a period that lasted from roughly 1100 to 800 BCE. It is called dark not only because it was a time of hardship and disruption, but also because it is dark to us, shrouded in obscurity. The Linear B script, used by Mycenaean scribes to record the affairs of the palaces, disappeared entirely. For 4 centuries, Greece was a preliterate society, without written records of any kind. When writing returned, it was in a completely different script. The Greek alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians, and the old syllabic script was forgotten. The tablets inscribed in Linear B would remain unreadable until the 1950s, when a young British architect named Michael Ventris finally deciphered them. For the people living through the Dark Age, the palaces and their bureaucracies must have seemed like a distant, almost mythical past. The disappearance of writing was both a cause and a consequence of the broader collapse. Writing in the Bronze Age had been the tool of palace administration, used to track the complex flows of goods and labor that sustained the palace economies. Scribes were trained professionals, part of the palace elite. When the palaces fell, the need for writing disappeared. There were no longer vast inventories to track, no rations to distribute, no tribute to record. The communities that survived in the Dark Age were small and decentralized, organized around kinship and local leadership rather than centralized bureaucracy. In such a world, literacy was not only unnecessary but impossible to sustain. The training of scribes required resources and institutional support that no longer existed. And so the knowledge of writing was lost, not in a single generation, but gradually, as the last scribes died without passing on their skills. The physical landscape of Greece changed profoundly in the wake of the collapse. The great palace centers were abandoned, their massive walls left to crumble. Population declined sharply, perhaps by as much as 75% in some regions. The elaborate pottery styles of the Mycenaean period, with their painted scenes of chariots and warriors, gave way to simpler geometric designs, concentric circles, zigzag lines, meanders. Monumental architecture virtually disappeared. The large tholos tombs, elaborate beehive-shaped structures where Mycenaean elites had been buried with rich grave goods, were no longer built. Instead, the dead were cremated, and their ashes placed in simple urns. This shift reflects not only a change in funerary practice, but a change in social organization. The resources and labor required to build a tholos tomb, or to fill it with gold jewelry and bronze weapons, were no longer available. Imagine walking through the Greek countryside in the early Dark Age, perhaps around 1050 BCE. The landscape is dotted with ruins. You pass the remains of a Mycenaean palace, its walls still standing but empty, the roof long since collapsed. Wild flowers grow in the courtyards where processions once passed. The chambers that once housed archives and storerooms are now home to birds and small animals. If you venture inside, you might find fragments of pottery scattered on the floor, the broken remains of pithoi, or pieces of frescoed plaster showing the ghostly outline of a figure or a floral design. But there is no sound of human activity, no smoke rising from hearths, no voices. The palace is a shell, a monument to a world that no longer exists. As you continue your journey, you come to a village. It is nothing like the bustling settlements of the Bronze Age, with their specialized craftsmen and their connections to the wider world. This village consists of perhaps a dozen simple houses, built of stone and mud brick with thatched roofs. Each house has a single room, with a hearth at the center for cooking and warmth. There are no frescoes here, no painted floors. The pottery is handmade, not thrown on a wheel, and decorated with simple geometric patterns. The people who live here are farmers and shepherds. They grow barley and wheat in small fields, tend flocks of sheep and goats, and gather wild plants for food and medicine. They make their own tools and clothing, weave their own cloth, and trade only rarely with neighboring communities. This is a world of self-sufficiency, of survival rather than surplus. Daily life in a Dark Age village was shaped by the rhythms of the agricultural year. In the spring, you would plow the fields, using a simple wooden plow pulled by oxen. The soil in many parts of Greece is thin and rocky, and farming required constant labor, clearing stones, terracing hillsides, managing the limited water supply. You would sow barley and wheat, the staple crops, and tend small plots of vegetables, lentils, beans, onions. In the summer, you would harvest the grain, cutting it with a bronze or iron sickle, and threshing it on a stone threshing floor. The work was hard and the yields uncertain, always dependent on the vagaries of weather and rainfall. In the autumn, you would gather olives and press them for oil, and harvest grapes to make wine. These tasks were communal, involving the entire household and often neighbors as well. In the winter, when the fields lay fallow, you would spend your days repairing tools, mending clothing, and tending the animals in their pens. The household was the basic unit of social and economic organization. Extended families lived together with grandparents, parents, and children, all sharing the same space. The head of the household, typically the eldest male, made decisions about planting and harvest, about trade and alliances with other families. Women managed the domestic sphere, preparing food, weaving cloth, and raising children. Weaving was a task of particular importance. Wool from the household's sheep was carded, spun into thread, and woven on an upright loom into cloth for clothing and blankets. The cloth might be left its natural color, a creamy off-white or gray-brown, or dyed with vegetable dyes. Soft yellows from weld, reds from madder, blues from woad. The process was time-consuming, requiring skill and patience, and a single garment might represent weeks of labor. At night, the household would gather around the hearth. The fire provided warmth and light, and it was the center of domestic life. The hearth was sacred, associated with the goddess Hestia, and tending the fire was a ritual act. You would sit on low stools or on the floor, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. The evening meal was simple: barley porridge or bread, perhaps flavored with onions or herbs, and cheese made from sheep's or goat's milk. On special occasions, there might be meat, a goat or sheep slaughtered for a festival or to mark an important event. The meat would be roasted over the fire, and the bones burned as an offering to the gods. Wine, if available, would be mixed with water and drunk from simple clay cups. These evening gatherings were also a time for storytelling. In the absence of writing, oral tradition became the primary means of preserving and transmitting knowledge. Stories were passed from generation to generation, told and retold around the fire. Some were practical, genealogies that recorded the lineage of the family and its connections to other families, essential knowledge in a world where kinship determined social standing and obligations. Others were stories of the past, tales of heroes and gods, of great wars and distant lands. These stories were not fixed texts but living traditions, shaped and reshaped by each teller. A skilled storyteller was valued, someone who could hold the attention of the household, who knew the old tales and could weave them into compelling narratives. Among the stories told were memories, however distorted, of the Bronze Age world that had been lost. Tales of great kings who lived in palaces of stone, who commanded fleets of ships and armies of bronze-clad warriors. Stories of Troy, the great city across the sea, and of the war that was fought to reclaim a stolen queen. Stories of Mycenae, rich in gold, and of Thebes with its 7 gates. These stories preserved a kind of cultural memory, a sense that there had once been a time of greater wealth and power, a heroic age when men were stronger and braver than they were now. But the memory was vague and mythologized. The Linear B script was forgotten, the details of palace administration lost. What remained were the outlines of epic narrative, the names of heroes and places, the themes of honor and revenge and homecoming. As the Dark Age wore on, a new technology began to spread slowly across the Mediterranean world. The knowledge of ironworking. Iron had been known in small quantities during the Bronze Age, but it was rare and expensive, a luxury metal used for jewelry and ceremonial objects. The collapse of the Bronze Age trade networks, which had supplied copper and especially tin, created both a crisis and an opportunity. Without access to tin, bronze production became difficult or impossible. Communities were forced to seek alternatives, and iron, abundant in local ores, provided an answer. The transition was not sudden. Bronze tools and weapons continued to be used and valued for generations. But gradually, ironworking became more widespread, and iron began to replace bronze as the metal of choice for everyday tools and weapons. The process of smelting iron was more difficult than smelting bronze. Iron ore had to be heated to much higher temperatures that could not be achieved in a simple open fire. Early ironsmiths built specialized furnaces, often dug into hillsides to take advantage of natural drafts. The furnace was filled with layers of charcoal and iron ore, and the fire was stoked for hours, sometimes days, until the ore began to melt and the impurities, the slag, separated out. The resulting mass of iron, called a bloom, was not liquid but a spongy lump of metal mixed with slag. This bloom had to be reheated and hammered repeatedly, folding and working the metal to drive out the slag and create a usable piece of iron. The process was labor-intensive and required considerable skill and experience. The quality of the iron varied depending on the ore and the skill of the smith, and early iron was often brittle and inferior to good bronze. But iron had one enormous advantage. It was abundant. Iron ore could be found in many places, and communities no longer depended on long-distance trade to obtain the metal they needed for tools and weapons. Over time, ironsmiths learned to produce better quality metal. They discovered that by repeatedly heating and hammering the iron, they could create a harder, more durable product. They learned to carburize the iron, adding carbon by heating it in contact with charcoal, producing a kind of steel. Iron plowshares made it possible to cultivate heavier soils. Iron axes made it easier to clear forests for farmland. Iron weapons, though initially inferior to bronze, eventually surpassed them in availability and with improvements in technique, in quality as well. Imagine visiting an ironworker's smithy in a Dark Age village. The smithy is set apart from the other buildings, often on the edge of the settlement, because of the noise and the danger of fire. The furnace is a low stone structure, its interior blackened with soot and slag. The bellows, worked by an apprentice, force air into the furnace, making the charcoal glow white hot. The smith, his face and arms darkened by soot and sweat, tends the furnace with practiced care. When the bloom is ready, he pulls it from the fire with long tongs and carries it to his anvil, a large flat stone. There, with a heavy hammer, he begins to work the metal, each blow ringing out across the village. The bloom is reheated and hammered again and again, slowly taking shape as a blade or a tool. Sparks fly with each strike, and the smell of hot metal fills the air. The work is exhausting and dangerous, but the smith is a figure of respect and some awe. He possesses knowledge that most do not. The secrets of transforming earth into metal, of shaping tools that can cut and kill. The spread of ironworking had profound social and economic consequences. In the Bronze Age, the production of bronze had been controlled by palace elites, who monopolized access to the rare tin required. Iron, by contrast, was more democratic. Local smiths could produce tools and weapons without depending on distant trade networks or elite patronage. This contributed to the decentralization of power that characterized the Dark Age. Without the palaces, Without the centralized redistribution of resources, communities became more self-reliant and egalitarian. Leadership was based on kinship, personal prowess, and the ability to command loyalty, not on control of trade or literacy. This was a world of chiefs and elders, not kings and bureaucrats. In this world without writing, memory was everything. The preservation of the past depended entirely on oral transmission, and certain individuals within the community took on the role of preserving and performing the traditional stories. These were the bards, the singers of tales, known in Greek as oidoi. A bard was both an entertainer and a custodian of cultural memory. He had memorized vast amounts of poetry, genealogies, hymns to the gods, and above all, the great epic narratives that told the stories of the heroic age. These epics were not recited from memory in the way we might memorize a written text. They were composed in performance, using a flexible repertoire of formulaic phrases and traditional themes. A skilled bard could improvise a story, adapting it to his audience and the occasion, while still adhering to the traditional patterns and content. The most important of these oral traditions were the stories that would eventually be written down as the Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to a poet named Homer. These epics tell the story of the Trojan War and its aftermath, the rage of Achilles, the death of Hector, the fall of Troy, and the long wandering journey of Odysseus as he struggles to return home. The poems are set in the heroic past, the age of the great Mycenaean palaces, but they were shaped by centuries of oral performance during the Dark Age. They preserve garbled memories of Bronze Age civilization, descriptions of palaces and bronze armor, references to writing and complex social hierarchies. But they also reflect the world of the Dark Age bards who performed them, a world of warriors and chiefs, of personal honor and loyalty, of gift-giving and feasting. Imagine sitting in a chief's hall on a winter evening, listening to a bard perform. The hall is a simple structure, larger than the ordinary houses, but built in the same style. Stone walls, a thatched roof, a central hearth. The fire burns brightly, casting its light on the faces gathered around. The chief sits in a place of honor, perhaps on a chair or throne, while his retainers and guests sit on benches along the walls. The bard stands or sits near the fire, holding a lyre, a small stringed instrument that he uses to accompany his singing. He begins to play, plucking the strings in a rhythmic pattern, and then his voice rises, chanting the verses of the epic in a distinctive musical cadence. The language is archaic and formal, different from everyday speech, filled with repeated epithets and phrases: swift-footed Achilles, the wine-dark sea, rosy-fingered dawn. As the bard sings, the story unfolds. You hear of the gathering of the Greek heroes at Aulis, of the fleet of 1,000 ships that sailed to Troy, of the 10-year siege and the battles beneath the walls. You hear the names of heroes, Achilles and Hector, Ajax and Diomedes, Odysseus of many wiles. You hear of divine intervention, of gods and goddesses taking sides, of Zeus the thunderer and Athena of the grey eyes. The story is filled with vivid formulaic descriptions: the clang of bronze armor, the thud of spears striking shields, the cries of the dying. The bard's voice rises and falls, the lyre accompanying, and the listeners are transported. For a time, the dark world outside, the cold and the uncertainty, fades away. You are in the heroic past, a time of glory and greatness, when men were closer to the gods and deeds were immortalized in song. These performances served multiple purposes. They were entertainment, a break from the monotony and hardship of daily life. They were education, teaching young people the values and traditions of their culture, the importance of honor and loyalty, the proper conduct of a warrior, the relationship between mortals and gods. And they were memory, preserving a connection to the past, however distorted and mythologized. The bards were not historians in the modern sense. They were not concerned with factual accuracy or chronological precision, but they carried within them the collective memory of their people, the stories that defined who they were and where they came from. The oral tradition was remarkably resilient. Even as generations passed and the details of the Bronze Age world faded, the basic outlines of the stories remained. The formulaic nature of oral poetry, with its repeated phrases and traditional scenes, made it easier to memorize and transmit. A young bard learning the craft would listen to his master perform again and again, absorbing the patterns and rhythms, the stock epithets and narrative structures. He would learn to compose his own versions of the traditional stories, improvising within the framework of the tradition. In this way, The epics were passed down through the centuries of the Dark Age, changing slowly, accumulating layers of interpretation and embellishment, but never disappearing entirely. The Greeks were not the only people to preserve their past through oral tradition during this period. Across the Mediterranean, other cultures were developing their own bodies of traditional poetry and song. The Phoenicians, a Semitic people who inhabited the coastal cities of what is now Lebanon, were renowned as sailors and traders. They too had oral traditions, stories of gods and heroes, of voyages to distant lands. But the Phoenicians would make a contribution to world history that went far beyond their own stories. They would develop the alphabet, the writing system that would eventually replace the cumbersome syllabaries of the Bronze Age and make literacy accessible to a much wider range of people. The Phoenician alphabet emerged sometime around 1050 BCE, in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. Unlike the complex scripts that had been used in the Bronze Age, cuneiform with its hundreds of signs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, linear B with its syllabic symbols, the Phoenician system was strikingly simple. It consisted of just 22 characters, each representing a single consonant sound. Vowels were not written, a feature common to Semitic languages, where the consonantal framework of a word carries most of the meaning. This simplicity was revolutionary. A scribe no longer needed years of training to master hundreds of symbols. Anyone with a few weeks or months of instruction could learn to read and write. The development of the alphabet was likely driven by practical needs. The Phoenician cities, unlike the great palace centers of the Bronze Age, were merchant states. Their power was based not on territorial conquest or agricultural surplus, but on trade. Phoenician sailors ranged across the Mediterranean, establishing trading posts and colonies from Cyprus to Spain. They traded in timber from the forests of Lebanon, purple dye made from murex shells, glass and metalwork. To conduct this trade, they needed a writing system that was easy to learn and use, one that could be employed by merchants and traders who did not have the time or resources for extensive scribal training. The alphabet met that need perfectly. The Phoenician script was written from right to left, inscribed on papyrus, pottery, stone and metal. The letters were angular and simple, derived from earlier pictographic symbols but abstracted to the point where they no longer resembled the objects they originally depicted. Over the course of the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, as Phoenician merchants traveled across the Mediterranean, they carried their alphabet with them. Inscriptions in Phoenician have been found in Cyprus, in Sardinia, in North Africa, where the Phoenicians founded the great city of Carthage, and in Spain. And crucially, the alphabet reached the Greeks. The Greeks encountered the Phoenician script sometime in the 8th century BCE, perhaps through trade contacts in the eastern Mediterranean, or in the Phoenician colonies in Cyprus. They adopted the Phoenician letters and adapted them to the needs of the Greek language. Because Greek, unlike Phoenician, relies heavily on vowel sounds to distinguish meanings, the Greeks took several of the Phoenician letters that represented consonants not used in Greek and repurposed them as vowels. The Phoenician letter aleph became the Greek alpha, a vowel sound. The Phoenician he became epsilon, and so on. This innovation, the addition of vowels to the alphabet, made the Greek script even more flexible and expressive than its Phoenician parent. The reintroduction of writing to Greece was a transformative event. For the first time in 400 years, it became possible to record language in a durable form. But the new script was fundamentally different from the old Linear B. Linear B had been the tool of palace bureaucrats, used for accounting and administration. The Greek alphabet, by contrast, was a democratic technology, accessible to anyone who took the time to learn it. Early Greek inscriptions are found not in palace archives but on pottery, on tombstones and scratched into rocks. They include names, dedications to the gods, even snippets of poetry. The earliest surviving example of alphabetic Greek is an inscription on a pottery cup, dated to around 740 BCE, found on the island of Ischia. The inscription is playful, teasing, "I am Nestor's cup, good to drink from. Whoever drinks from this cup will soon be struck with desire for beautiful crowned Aphrodite." With the return of literacy came the possibility of recording the oral epics that had been passed down through the Dark Age. Sometime in the 8th or early 7th century BCE, the poems we know as the Iliad and the Odyssey were written down for the first time. The process by which this happened is obscure and much debated. Did a single poet, Homer, compose the epics orally and then dictate them to a scribe? Or were they written down by a poet who was himself literate, combining and editing the oral traditions into a fixed written form? We do not know with certainty, and the figure of Homer himself is shadowy and perhaps mythical. But what is clear is that the poems, once written down, became canonical. They were copied and studied, memorized by students, and performed at public festivals. They became the foundation of Greek education and culture, the shared inheritance of all Greek-speaking people. The 8th century BCE was a time of broader revival and transformation across the Greek world. Population, which had declined so sharply in the wake of the Bronze Age collapse, began to grow again. New settlements were founded, and existing villages expanded into towns and cities. This period saw the beginning of what archaeologists call the Archaic period, the time when the distinctive features of classical Greek civilization began to emerge. One of the most important developments was the rise of the polis, the city-state. A polis was more than a city in the modern sense. It was a political community, a body of citizens who governed themselves collectively. The typical polis consisted of an urban center, often built around a fortified hill called an acropolis, and the surrounding countryside, which provided food and resources. The polis was a new kind of social organization, quite different from the palace-centered kingdoms of the Bronze Age or the small kinship-based communities of the Dark Age. It was based on the idea of citizenship, the notion that free adult males who belonged to the community had a share in its governance. The exact form of government varied from polis to polis. Some were ruled by kings, others by aristocratic councils, and a few experimented with more democratic forms. But the underlying principle was the same. Political power was not the exclusive possession of a single individual or family, but was distributed among the citizens. This was a revolutionary idea, and it would shape the course of Western political thought for millennia. Another important development of the Archaic period was the colonization of the Mediterranean. As the population of Greece grew, land became scarce. Many polis sent out groups of colonists to establish new settlements in distant lands. Greek colonies were founded along the coasts of the Black Sea, in southern Italy and Sicily, in North Africa, and in southern France and Spain. These colonies were not subject to the mother city, but were independent polis in their own right, though they often maintained cultural and religious ties to their place of origin. The colonization movement brought the Greeks into contact with other peoples and cultures, the indigenous populations of Italy and Sicily, the Phoenicians in North Africa and Spain, the Scythians on the steppes north of the Black Sea. It also extended the reach of Greek culture and the Greek language across a vast area, creating a network of interconnected communities bound by shared language, religion, and customs. Trade revived during the Archaic period, though it was different in character from the Bronze Age trade networks. There was no longer a single dominant power controlling the flow of goods. Instead, trade was conducted by independent merchants, often associated with specific polis. Greek traders sailed across the Mediterranean, carrying wine and olive oil, fine pottery decorated with painted scenes, and increasingly, slaves captured in war or purchased from foreign traders. They returned with grain from Egypt and the Black Sea, timber from Macedonia, metals from Spain, and luxury goods from the East. The economies of the Greek polis became increasingly specialized and interconnected. Athens, for example, developed a thriving pottery industry, producing the distinctive black figure and later red figure vases that were exported across the Mediterranean. The Archaic period also saw the codification of law. In many polis, the customary laws that had been preserved orally during the Dark Age were written down and publicly displayed. This was an important step in the development of the polis as a political community. Written laws were more transparent and less subject to manipulation by powerful individuals. They could be learned and cited by ordinary citizens, providing a check on arbitrary authority. The earliest surviving example of written Greek law is the Law Code of Gortyn in Crete, inscribed on stone around 450 BCE, but the practice of writing down laws began much earlier. The writing of law was often a response to social conflict, an attempt to resolve disputes between different factions within the polis, between the aristocracy and the common people, between creditors and debtors, between established residents and newcomers. In Athens, the lawgiver Draco codified the city's laws in 621 BCE. His code was famously harsh, so harsh that later Greeks joked that it was written in blood rather than ink. The death penalty was prescribed for even minor offenses. A few decades later, another lawgiver, Solon, reformed the Athenian legal system, abolishing debt slavery and establishing a more graduated set of punishments. Solon's reforms were part of a broader effort to address the growing inequality within Athenian society and to prevent the kind of social unrest that had torn apart other polis. His reforms were not entirely successful, and Athens would go through further political upheavals in the decades that followed. But they represented an important step in the development of Athenian democracy. The re-emergence of Greek civilization in the Archaic period was accompanied by a flourishing of art and architecture. The simple geometric pottery of the early Dark Age gave way to more elaborate styles. In the 8th century, potters began to decorate their vases with scenes from myth and daily life, warriors in battle, chariots, processions, funerals. The figures were rendered in a stylized, almost abstract manner, but they show a new confidence and ambition. By the 7th century, Greek artists were producing large-scale sculpture in stone, influenced by the art of Egypt and the Near East. The earliest stone sculptures, known as kouroi and kourai, depict standing male and female figures. They are stiff and formal, with rigid frontal poses and stylized anatomy, but they represent a major artistic achievement. These statues were often placed in sanctuaries as offerings to the gods or used as grave markers. Architecture also underwent a transformation. The simple houses and halls of the Dark Age were gradually replaced by more substantial structures. The most important architectural development was the Greek temple, a building type that would become one of the defining features of Greek civilization. The earliest temples were modest structures, built of wood and mud brick, but over time they became larger and more elaborate. By the 6th century BCE, temples were being constructed entirely of stone, with columns supporting a tiled roof and elaborate sculptural decoration. The basic form of the Greek temple, with its rectangular floor plan, surrounding colonnade and pediment filled with sculpture, was established during the Archaic period and would remain remarkably consistent for centuries. The temples were not places of congregational worship in the way that churches or mosques are. Instead, they served as houses for the gods, structures to hold the cult statue and the offerings made by worshippers. Religious rituals took place outside the temple, at an altar in front of the building where animals were sacrificed and their meat shared among the worshippers. The temple was a statement of the polis's wealth and piety, a visible symbol of the community's relationship with the divine. The construction of a large stone temple required enormous resources and coordinated effort, and only prosperous polis could afford such projects. The temples were also works of art, decorated with painted sculpture and elaborate architectural details, showcasing the skill of the community's craftsmen. The religious life of the archaic Greeks was deeply intertwined with the social and political life of the polis. The gods were thought to be intimately concerned with human affairs, intervening in battles, sending omens, rewarding piety, and punishing hubris. Each polis had its own patron deity, Athena for Athens, Hera for Argos, Apollo for Delphi. But the Greeks also recognized a shared pantheon of gods who were worshipped across the Greek world. This shared religion was one of the things that united the Greeks despite their political fragmentation. The Olympic Games, founded traditionally in 776 BCE, were a religious festival held in honor of Zeus at Olympia. Athletes from across the Greek world gathered every 4 years to compete in running, wrestling, boxing, and chariot racing. The games were also an occasion for poets and orators to perform, for political alliances to be made, and for the Greeks to reaffirm their common identity. The world that emerged from the Dark Age was in many ways profoundly different from the Bronze Age world that had preceded it. The palace civilizations with their centralized bureaucracies and their scribal elites were gone forever. In their place were the independent polis, communities of citizens who governed themselves, who traded and colonized, who worshipped their gods and celebrated their culture. The new writing system, the alphabet, was democratic rather than exclusive, accessible to all who wished to learn it. The economy was no longer based on palace-controlled redistribution, but on market exchange and the initiative of individual merchants and craftsmen. The social hierarchy was less rigid, and political power, at least in some polis, was more widely shared. And yet the Greeks of the Archaic period retained a profound connection to the heroic past. The oral traditions that had been preserved through the Dark Age became, with the return of literacy, the foundation texts of Greek culture. The Iliad and the Odyssey were studied and memorized. their heroes held up as models of excellence. The memory of the Bronze Age, however distorted, continued to shape Greek identity. The Greeks believed that they were descended from the heroes of the Trojan War, that their polis had been founded by gods and demigods. This belief in a glorious past, a time when men were greater than they were now, was a powerful force. It inspired them to emulate the deeds of their ancestors, to seek honor and glory, to build temples and cities worthy of their heritage. What had been lost in the collapse? The answer is complex. In purely material terms, the loss was enormous. The palaces were gone, with their elaborate frescoes and their hoards of gold and bronze. The complex international trade networks had been shattered. Literacy had disappeared for 4 centuries. Population had declined, and many of the technical skills of the Bronze Age had been forgotten. But in other ways, the collapse had created space for new developments. The centralized hierarchical palace systems had been replaced by more decentralized, participatory forms of social organization. The alphabet made literacy accessible in a way that linear beer never had. The use of iron, though initially a response to the scarcity of bronze, eventually made metal tools and weapons more widely available. Archaeological evidence from the Dark Age paints a picture of simplification and decline, but also of adaptation and resilience. The pottery of the early Dark Age is simpler than Mycenaean pottery, but it is not without beauty. The geometric patterns that decorate Dark Age vases, concentric circles and zigzags and meanders, have a stark elegance. They reflect a different aesthetic, one that valued abstraction and pattern over naturalistic representation. The burial practices of the Dark Age, with their emphasis on cremation and simple grave goods, suggest a more egalitarian society, one in which ostentatious displays of wealth were less common. Even the abandonment of the palaces, tragic as it must have been for those who experienced it, allowed for a kind of social experimentation. Without the weight of established bureaucracies and entrenched elites, new forms of community and governance could emerge. The collapse also had unintended consequences for cultural memory. The oral traditions that developed during the Dark Age, precisely because they were not fixed in writing, were flexible and adaptable. They could be reshaped to meet the needs and interests of each new generation of listeners. The epics that were finally written down in the 8th century were the product of centuries of oral performance, and they bear the marks of that long process. They preserve genuine memories of the Bronze Age, descriptions of palaces and bronze armor, references to places that existed only in the Mycenaean period, but they also reflect the values and concerns of the Dark Age bards who shaped them. The result is a complex blend of history and myth, a vision of the past that is both rooted in reality and transformed by imagination. The rediscovery of the Bronze Age past in the modern era has been a long and fascinating process. For centuries, the world of Mycenaean Troy existed only in myth, in the pages of Homer and the Greek tragedians. It was assumed that the Trojan War, if it had happened at all, was too remote and too mythologized to be accessible to historical inquiry. That changed in the 19th century, when a German businessman turned amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann set out to prove that the Homeric epics were based on real places and real events. In the 1870s, Schliemann excavated at Hisarlik in Turkey, which he identified as the site of Troy, and uncovered the remains of an ancient city that had been destroyed by fire. He then turned his attention to Mycenae, where he excavated the famous shaft graves and discovered the gold funeral mask that he famously, if incorrectly, identified as the Mask of Agamemnon. Schulemann's methods were crude by modern standards, and his interpretations were often flawed, but his discoveries were sensational. They demonstrated that the world described in the Homeric epics was not purely imaginary, but had roots in historical reality. In the decades that followed, archaeologists excavated other Mycenaean sites, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes. In the early 20th century, Sir Arthur Evans excavated the palace at Knossos in Crete, uncovering the Minoan civilization that had flourished before the rise of the Mycenaeans. These excavations revealed a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization with elaborate palaces, advanced art and architecture, and a complex economy. They also uncovered thousands of clay tablets inscribed in Linear B, the script used by Mycenaean scribes. For decades, Linear B remained undeciphered. Scholars could see that it was a syllabic script, but they did not know what language it recorded. Some thought it might be a pre-Greek language, related to the Minoan language recorded in the still undeciphered Linear A script. The breakthrough came in 1952, when Michael Ventris, a British architect with a passion for ancient scripts, demonstrated that Linear B recorded an early form of Greek. His decipherment was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, and it opened a window into the world of the Mycenaean palaces. The tablets revealed the workings of the palace economies, inventories of goods, records of rations distributed to workers, lists of offerings to the gods. They provided names of people and places, many of which could be recognized from the Homeric epics. The tablets confirmed that the Bronze Age Greeks did indeed have a writing system, and that the world described, however fancifully, in the epics had a basis in historical fact. The modern study of the Bronze Age collapse has drawn on a wide range of evidence: archaeological excavations, ancient texts, climate data from tree rings and ice cores, geological evidence for earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Scholars have proposed many different theories to explain the collapse. Some emphasize environmental factors, prolonged drought and famine that destabilized the palace economies. Others point to the disruptions caused by the Sea Peoples, though who exactly these groups were and where they came from remains debated. Still others argue for internal factors, social unrest, slave revolts, the breakdown of the palatial system from within. The truth is likely that the collapse was the result of a complex combination of all these factors, a perfect storm of environmental stress, military invasion, and social upheaval. What is clear is that the collapse was not simply a disaster, but also a transformation. The Dark Age that followed was a period of hardship and simplification, but it was also a period of adaptation and innovation. The Greek world that emerged from the Dark Age was different from the Bronze Age world, but it was not inferior. In some ways, it was more dynamic and more creative. The development of the alphabet, the rise of the polis, the flourishing of oral poetry, the colonization of the Mediterranean, all of these were products of the post-collapse world. The collapse forced the Greeks to rebuild their civilization from the ground up, and in the process they created something new and enduring. Standing today among the ruins of a Mycenaean palace, you can feel the weight of that long history. The massive stone walls still stand, weathered by millennia of wind and rain. The chambers where scribes once worked, where kings once held court, are open to the sky. The frescoes have faded. The roof timbers have long since rotted away, and the clay tablets lie in museum cases, their script finally deciphered after thousands of years. But the stones remain, silent witnesses to a world that rose, fell, and rose again in a different form. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that civilizations are fragile, that the systems we build, however sophisticated, can fail. But it also reminds us of the resilience of human communities, the capacity to endure even the most catastrophic disruptions, to preserve what is essential, and to rebuild. The Greeks of the Dark Age lost their writing, their palaces, their trade networks. They lost for a time much of the material wealth and complexity of the Bronze Age. But they did not lose their stories, their sense of identity, their connection to the past. They carried these things through the darkness, in the memories of bards and storytellers, in the rituals and traditions that bound their communities together. And when the light began to return, when writing was reintroduced and the polis began to flourish, they were ready to create a new civilization, one that would remember the heroic past even as it forged a new and different future. The legacy of the Dark Age is still with us today. The Greek alphabet, adapted from the Phoenician script during that period of recovery, became the basis for the Latin alphabet used across the Western world. The Homeric epics, shaped by centuries of oral performance during the Dark Age, remain foundational texts of Western literature. The polis, the city-state that emerged in the aftermath of the collapse, became the model for political experimentation and philosophical inquiry that would give rise to democracy, philosophy, and much of what we consider classical Greek culture. The Dark Age was a time of loss, but it was also a time of creation. And so our journey through the long twilight comes to an end. We have walked through the ruins of palaces, sat by the fires of Dark Age villages, listened to the songs of bards, and watched as the light slowly returned. We have seen how a world can fall apart, and yet, through the resilience and creativity of those who survive, be rebuilt into something new. The Bronze Age collapse was a catastrophe, but it was not the end. It was a transformation, a passage from one age to another, from bronze to iron, from palace to polis, from syllabary to alphabet. The stones still stand, scattered across the Greek landscape and beyond. The walls of Mycenae, the ruins of Pylos, the foundations of Troy, they are monuments to both what was lost and what endured. They remind us that history is not a straight line of progress, but a complex, layered process of rise and fall, forgetting and remembering, destruction and rebirth. The civilization that forgot how to write eventually remembered, and in remembering, created a new world. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. Our story fades now, but the echoes of that distant world remain, in the stones and the stories, in the alphabet we use and the epics we still read. The dark age is over. The light has returned, but the memory of that long night and the courage of those who lived through it endures. Until next time, rest well and dream of ancient fires, of voices singing in the darkness, and of the slow, patient work of rebuilding a world.